Man believes he's in control until he realizes he's not. Not because he's weak, but because the control was never forceful. It was sweet, gentle, invisible. Manipulation doesn't begin with power. It begins with warmth. The kind of warmth that disarms you, that makes you feel safe enough to open every door inside your mind. And once you've opened those doors, she doesn't need to break in. She simply walks through. You think you're choosing her, but she's already chosen the version of you she wants and is slowly sculpting him. He met her in a time of chaos. She was calm, understanding, a haven. When he spoke, she listened like no one else ever had. She remembered the smallest things, the ones even he forgot. When she laughed at his jokes, he felt funny again. When she told him she believed in him, he felt powerful again, but he didn't notice the pattern forming. Every time she complimented him, it was when he behaved correctly. When he pulled away, she withdrew her warmth. Her silence was never cold, it was strategic. It made him yearn for the version of himself she liked. Slowly, without realizing it, he began to filter his words, reshape his tone, and reprogram his instincts, just to keep her smile alive. He thought it was love, but love doesn't train. Love liberates. This is the basis of intermittent reinforcement, one of the most powerful psychological conditioning tools ever studied. The same mechanism used in casinos to keep gamblers hooked. A win here, a loss there, unpredictable rewards that trigger spikes in dopamine. The brain becomes addicted, not to the reward itself, but to the possibility of it. So when a woman alternates between affection and withdrawal, approval and silence, the man's nervous system doesn't see mixed signals. It sees potential, and potential is the strongest leash of all. The sweetest control never feels like control. It feels like a love you don't want to lose. But what makes her tactics so powerful isn't her intelligence. It's her ability to hide them behind emotion. The most dangerous manipulations aren't the ones you can see. They're the ones you feel. Because when emotion wears the mask of sincerity, logic doesn't stand a chance. Women, consciously or not, learn early on that influence isn't about domination. It's about direction. A raised voice repels. A trembling voice attracts. Tears can stop the most heated argument. A soft apology can extinguish a man's anger faster than reason ever could. This is emotional camouflage, the ability to disguise control under vulnerability. It's not deception as we think of lies. It's framing, a mastery of context. The power doesn't come from what she says, but from how she makes him feel while she says it. He was logical, down to earth, not easily influenced, until the night she cried, not loudly, quietly, controlled, the kind of crying that made him feel responsible. She said, "I just wish you cared as much as I did." It wasn't an accusation, it was a confession, and instantly all the defenses he'd built crumbled. The next day, he changed his behavior. Not because she demanded it, but because she anchored his guilt to her pain. It's a graceful maneuver, often invisible even to the woman herself. This is rooted in attachment theory and emotional conditioning. Humans are programmed to protect those they perceive as emotionally fragile. When someone we love seems hurt because of us, our brain releases oxytocin and cortisol simultaneously. A cocktail of guilt and bonding. It teaches us, make her happy again and the discomfort will stop. This is camouflaged reinforcement, the cycle of pain and relief that traps the logical mind in emotional chains. Over time, this dynamic erodes male boundaries. He begins to self-censor. He avoids the truth that might hurt him. He becomes emotionally domesticated. When guilt replaces logic, you're no longer thinking, you're being trained. But not all control comes from tears. Some forms are silent, seductive, and nearly invisible. Every man exchanges something for connection, but few realize that what they're offering isn't attention, money, or time. It's validation. And once she controls that currency, she controls him. Validation is the most addictive substance in the modern emotional economy. It's not love, it's not intimacy, it's approval. That subtle nod that says, "You're enough, for now." When that approval becomes the measure of a man's worth, he no longer acts out of force. He acts out of necessity. She doesn't need to overtly manipulate. She just needs to decide when to validate and when to deny. Every compliment becomes a leash. Every moment of coldness becomes a command. And because validation feels like connection, the man mistakes obedience for love. He used to post online without a second thought. Then she started watching. A simple, "Do you really think this is funny?" was enough to make him delete the post. He didn't want her to belittle him. Later, she praised his maturity. Now he filters everything, his humor, his opinions, even his ambition, through her invisible standard. It's not that she asked for control, it's that he offered it, one approval at a time. She's learned the rhythm: criticize when he acts freely, reward when he obeys. And he never realized that his growth was actually her design. This is a classic case of intermittent validation, a cousin of intermittent reinforcement. It activates the brain's dopaminergic pathways, the same mechanism behind addiction. Social psychologists call this the approval addiction cycle. Reward with praise, withdraw without warning, watch the subject pursue consistency. Soon, he begins to anticipate the rules, modifying his own behavior to keep his emotional balance intact. He becomes the architect of his own control. Philosophically, this mirrors Nietzsche's concept of self-enslavement. The man who surrenders his will to another's approval replaces his internal compass with external permission. The moment her approval defines your peace, you've sold your freedom for comfort. But validation is only one side of the equation. The other is punishment. Silent, cold, and devastating. Silence is not absence, it's strategy. When words disappear, they leave no peace. They leave space for your mind to destroy itself. The most effective punishment isn't anger, it's withdrawal, because anger at least gives you something to fight against. Silence gives you nothing. And in that emptiness, your brain fills the gaps with guilt, confusion, and despair. This is called emotional withholding, a form of control in which one partner withdraws affection, attention, or communication to reassert dominance. It's not about resolving conflicts, it's about conditioning behavior. The more you pursue silence, the deeper the lesson sinks in. I need to behave to be heard again. He didn't even know what he'd done wrong. One day, she stopped responding. No calls, no messages. Her social media remained active, but distant, refined, untouchable. He replayed their last conversation 100 times. Maybe it was the joke he'd made. Maybe he seemed distracted. The silence became a mirror for his doubts. Each unanswered message felt like proof of his failure. And when she finally reappeared, calm, kind, just needed space, he inundated her with apologies. He was relieved, not angry, and that's when the control was complete. She didn't yell, she didn't threaten, she just let him punish himself for her absence. At the heart of it is intermittent reinforcement again, but inverted. Instead of unpredictable rewards, it's unpredictable punishment. A psychological experiment in avoidance conditioning, when behavior is guided not by desire, but by fear of losing connection. This creates learned submission, a behavioral pattern in which the individual self-corrects before conflict even begins. The brain learns that obedience prevents pain, so it becomes careful, cautious, predictable, not because it's weak, but because it's trained. Philosophically, this echoes Carl Jung's concept of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we suppress to maintain harmony. Over time, it buries its authentic self beneath layers of politeness and restraint, mistaking silence for peace. When its silence makes you apologize for things you didn't do, it doesn't need to control you. You're already doing it for it. But what happens when silence stops working? When it can no longer control through absence, it turns to the final and most seductive form of power, the illusion of dependence. Control doesn't always feel like chains. Sometimes it feels like home. The cruelest illusion is when the cage feels safer than freedom itself. The most dangerous manipulations aren't built on fear, they're built on need. She doesn't need to convince him she's perfect. She just needs to convince him that without her, he's incomplete. This is the illusion of dependence, a psychological mirage where love becomes oxygen. She intertwines herself with his routines, his emotions, and his sense of self. Every victory becomes their success. Every pain becomes their struggle, until one day the line between her happiness and his existence dissolves. He doesn't stay because he's trapped. He stays because he believes she is his meaning. In the beginning, she supported his dreams. She encouraged him. She made him feel seen, as if the world finally understood him through her eyes. She listened to his goals, his fears, his weaknesses, and over time, she positioned herself as the answer to them all. When he was stressed, she calmed him. When he felt lost, she guided him. When he doubted himself, she reassured him. At first, it felt like love. But slowly, she began to take ownership of the things she once admired. When he succeeded, she would say, "See what we did?" When he failed, she would whisper, "Where would you be without me?" The question wasn't cruel, it was gentle. And that was what made her powerful. Each small act of reassurance became a strand in a larger web. When he realized he had stopped thinking for himself, he no longer knew who himself was. This is rooted in codependent attachment, the psychological state in which self-worth derives from another person's approval or emotional stability. It connects to attachment anxiety, the fear of abandonment that drives a person to overindulge and overcommit. But in manipulation, this process is engineered. She identifies his emotional voids and strategically fills them. Then, through subtle reinforcement, she convinces him that she is the only one who truly understands him. Once the emotional monopoly is established, he stops seeking external validation. His world shrinks to her. Philosophically, this reflects Erich Fromm's flight from freedom. When the responsibility for one's own happiness becomes heavy, it's easier to transfer it to someone else. Dependence feels like relief, but in reality, it's surrender. When love becomes your oxygen, the one who holds your breath holds your soul. But every illusion needs fuel, and when the dependence begins to fade, she needs to reignite the addiction through chaos, jealousy, and emotional whiplash. She'll make you feel like the center of her universe, and then she'll disappear without warning. And when you're ready to leave, she pulls you back in with a single message. "I miss you." This isn't love. This is conditioning. Emotional chaos isn't accidental, it's orchestrated. When consistency loses control, chaos becomes the new control mechanism. The goal? To keep his emotional state unstable enough that he can't think. Because when a man is caught between fear and hope, he's too busy surviving to see the pattern. She alternates between affection and rejection, warmth and distance, chaos and calm. Each phase resets his nervous system, keeping him hooked on the next wave. This is trauma bonding, a psychological cycle where pain and love become indistinguishable. Within a week, she's radiant, full of love, laughter, and touch. They talk about the future. She says things like, "You're the only one who truly understands me." He feels safe again, whole again. Then, without warning, everything changes. A cold tone, short answers, accusations that make no sense. He tries to reason, to understand, but logic fails. She shuts down, or explodes. Days of confusion follow. He can't eat, can't concentrate, and then a message. Simple. "Sorry, sometimes I get scared." Relief floods his chest. He forgives instantly. But this isn't reconciliation. It's a fresh start. And soon, the cycle begins again. This is the dark core of intermittent reinforcement in relationships, the pattern that turns love into a neurological addiction. When the brain experiences unpredictable emotional rewards, it releases spikes of dopamine far stronger than those created by consistency. The result is trauma bonding, a state in which the victim feels more connected the more unstable the relationship becomes. Neurologically, the same circuits triggered by gambling addiction or substance abuse are activated here. Each reconciliation is a blow, a temporary relief that cements a lasting attachment. Philosophically, this reflects Jung's shadow integration gone awry. The chaos doesn't just come from her, it awakens his own hidden chaos. She becomes both a mirror and a trigger, showing him the inner storm. When peace feels boring and chaos feels like love, you're not in love, you're in withdrawal. But even chaos has an expiration date. Eventually, the man breaks or awakens. Every story of control ends the same way, not in anger, but in realization. Because the greatest act of rebellion isn't fighting it, it's seeing it clearly. When the spell breaks, it doesn't shatter noisily. It dissolves, silently and painfully, like morning mist dissipating in the sunlight. The man begins to notice the patterns he once called passion, the manipulations he once mistook for love. And the truth hits him harder than any betrayal. He wasn't trapped by her power, he was trapped by her need to be loved. This is the paradox of awakening. You don't escape the manipulator by running away from her. You escape by confronting the part of yourself that needed her approval to feel worthy. One morning he didn't text her first, not out of anger but out of peace. He sat in silence, realizing for the first time that her voice was no longer the sound of comfort. It was the sound of control. He replayed every fight, every apology, every moment of chaos, and saw the invisible threads. The patterns weren't random, they were lessons, hard ones. He saw how his own emptiness had created the space for her to lead, and in that realization, he didn't feel hate, he felt clarity. That day, when her message arrived, "Do you still care?" he didn't respond. Not because he didn't care, but because he finally cared for himself. Recovering from emotional manipulation begins with awareness, not resistance. The man learns to identify trauma bonds for what they are, not signs of infatuation, but evidence of conditioning. He begins to rebuild self-validation, detaching his worth from external approval. This process is deeply aligned with Carl Jung's concept of individuation, the integration of the shadow, the rediscovery of the self beneath the illusion. When he learns to cope with discomfort instead of chasing its approval, he reconfigures his neural patterns. Dopamine no longer comes from its responses. It comes from his own progress. And it is at this moment that it loses its power, not through confrontation, but through transcendence. Freedom is not turning away from it. It is returning to oneself. But liberation isn't the end, it's the beginning. Because once you see how manipulation works, you start seeing it everywhere. In culture, in the media, in the silent expectations that shape modern love. And that realization, that dark, liberating truth, becomes the seed of wisdom. You think the story ends when you walk away. It doesn't. Because the final stage of awakening isn't freedom, it's reflection. The realization that what you saw in her was a reflection of what was dormant within you. The manipulator doesn't create your weakness, she reveals it. Every emotional chain she forged was anchored in something already inside you. Your fear of rejection, your hunger for validation, your secret belief that love must be earned. The truth is disturbing. She was the mirror that showed you the parts of yourself you refused to face. The parts that made you easy to control. Until you confront those shadows, they will find new faces to wear, different women, different stories, the same cycle repeated with new actors. That's why true healing isn't about blaming her. It's about embracing your reflection in her chaos. Months had passed since he'd walked away. Her voice no longer echoed in his mind, but her patterns did. Every time he felt lonely, he was tempted to find another version of her. Someone new to make him feel whole. But this time, he paused. He didn't scroll, he didn't text. He sat in silence, the same silence that once tormented him, and realized it was no longer punishment, it was space. In that stillness, he saw himself clearly, the child who once begged for attention, the man who feared abandonment, the soul who mistook control for care. And with that clarity came peace, not because he won, but because he understood. This phase is integration, the final phase of psychological recovery. It aligns with shadow work, the process of confronting repressed emotions, unmet needs, and inner contradictions. It's the transformation of pain into wisdom. The manipulative partner becomes the catalyst for individuation, the journey from dependence to self-awareness. Modern psychology calls this post-traumatic growth, when the trauma that once broke you becomes the foundation for strength and insight. It's not about forgiveness, it's the transcendence of the dynamic itself. They no longer need fear emotional control because they now understand the mechanics of it. Awareness dismantles the illusion. The one who made you lose yourself was simply showing you where you were never found. Ultimately, manipulation isn't just a story about power, it's a story about unconscious exchange between the controller and the controlled. One seeks validation through dominance, the other seeks identity through approval. Both are chasing something they lost long ago, wholeness. But once you acknowledge this truth, you no longer chase, you no longer submit, you simply see. And in that seeing, you become untouchable, because a man who knows his mind cannot be controlled, and a man who has found his shadow cannot be fooled by the light. Once you see the game, you stop playing, and that's when you win.